Happy New Year. I'm recording this. It's New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2022. Tomorrow is 2023. That's wild. It's crazy to me. And, it's the last day of the year. Reflection is a very important practice to me. And so I want to take some time to do that in this final episode of 2022. If you're listening, hey, I appreciate you being here. We're going to wrap up the year with one final episode. Today's topic is going to be how to start a podcast, right? So a big thing that I did this year is obviously I started this podcast. This podcast did not exist in 2021. I am 15 episodes in. This would be my 16th episode. And I've been thinking a lot about this analogy of fruit to root or fruit to soil. When you think about the things that you've accomplished in, this year, you look at it as like fruit, right? For example, like the fruit of this would be I started this podcast, right? Every podcast episode is essentially like fruit of sorts. It's something that, it's like a final result. Or like another, 2022 fruit was like me and my wife, we bought a condo, right? That's like fruit. Or I started, Big Day Barbers, right? That's fruit, or a brand, right? Whatever you accomplished, you can think of it as being fruit of sorts. Now, growth happens in the soil. What I mean by that is if you are not experiencing the fruit in your life that you want to experience, that probably has something to do with the roots or the soil, right? If something's wrong with the soil and you plant that seed and you water it, it actually might not grow, or maybe it ends up growing, but it doesn't taste as good. It actually has something to do with the soil. And I live here in the Central Coast of California, which is, it's wine country. And a friend of mine studied wine and viticulture in college at Cal Poly. And they talked a lot about the soil and how the soil actually has a huge effect on how wine tastes, right? Now, it's just so interesting to me is how the soil is actually where growth happens. And fruit is really, just the fruit of good soil. And this podcast, in a lot of ways, it's the fruit of a lot of hard work. If you're a podcast listener of a lot of shows, there's a lot, let me tell you, there's a lot that happens under the surface to make these shows possible. And so today, I'd love to share with you a little behind the scenes of this podcast. I want to talk about how I did it, just in case you're curious or maybe even want to start your own, which I think every barber shop should start their own podcast, by the way, as a method to connect with your clients and have an impact in your community. But hey, that's a different story. Maybe I'll save that for another episode. But so today, to wrap up 2022, this episode is going to be all about how I started this podcast and recorded what is now 16 episodes in 1 year. All right, let's dive in. Welcome to Beyond Barber School. I am your host, Barbara Doza. This podcast, Beyond Barber School, is a space where listeners will hear stories from barbers, educators, and founders that are elevating the barbering industry in and out of the barbershop. Our hope here is to empower barbers with the knowledge necessary to take a courageous next step in their barber journey. Welcome to Beyond Barber School. Okay, so when I had the idea of starting a podcast, it all started with me asking the question, like, what is my why, right? Why do I want to start a podcast? What would the podcast be about, right? What are the topics that I would cover? What would make that different than any of the other podcasts out there, right? And this is a big thing of where you kind of need to discover your niche, right? What is it going to be about? This would include doing research. For me, it included doing research on other barber podcasts that were out there. I just did a simple search on Apple Podcasts, like barber podcasts or barbershop podcasts, haircutting podcasts. I did the same search on Spotify, and I just wanted to see like what's already out there, right? What's popular, who are the voices that are here, listened to a couple of their episodes, and was like, can I bring something that's interesting or unique to this space that would make people, find value? So that's really where it starts, right? What's your why? Discover your niche. Once you think you've found a niche, like for me, I was like, I think I might have something here. I want to focus on barbers that are in barber school, and I want them to prepare for life beyond barber school. And I could bring on, guests, and I could cover topics that would be helpful for, barbers that are, emerging or starting out in their career. So once I kind of had that niche, then it was about brainstorming content, right? That's another step, is you got to brainstorm content. And this is where, there's no rules. Once, just grab a piece of paper or open up like a Google Doc. And I literally wrote out a list of about 50 barbers that I wanted to interview. And I also included alongside that barber whatever topic I wanted to talk to them about. I didn't want to just have a guest on just to have a guest on. I wanted to talk to them about something specific and something that was unique to that barber, something that they offered, to the industry. And so I just wrote out like a huge list of like 50 barbers. And then from there, I was like, okay, if, I'm not going to message all of them, who could I start with? And so I segmented that list down into smaller groups based on who I knew, like who I personally knew, people who I had met before, so that when I sent them maybe a message to interview them, I wasn't some random person, right? These are barbers where maybe they're actually already following me on Instagram, so it's easier for me to get visibility because, as you all know, if you send a message to someone on Instagram who's not actually following you back, your DM is going to go into the like requests pile. And so if they're already following me, I have a better chance of getting visibility. So I segmented the list into smaller groups and was like, okay, you know what? Let me start with these first few guests. So once I had the first like 5, I want to say, I sent just a message to them. It was just like a cold DM on Instagram. For the record, I coordinated all of my interviews through Instagram. And so I just messaged them and I was like, hey, I'm starting this podcast and I'm looking for guests actually to come on. I would, be stoked to have you on as a guest. And if you're interested, like, let me know. And if you are, I will write up an interview with a bunch of questions that I would love to ask you so that you kind of have an idea of what I want this podcast to be about. I don't want it just be, random, but I do want to have specific questions I ask you. So if you're interested, I'll send you that list and then we go from there. So I did that first because what worst case scenario is I spend all this time writing up an interview and then I message them and say they don't even see it, right? So I wanted to just start by seeing if it was something they were interested in. And then if they were actually interested, that's when I would actually go write the interview. Spoiler alert for the guests that I did have on. But once they said that they were interested, then I would write up the interview. So from there, I'd write up the interview and then I would send it out to them. And then if they said that this was something that they wanted to do, then I was like, okay, now we need to coordinate a time for us to actually do the interview. Now, when I messaged the first few, they all were interested. So I was like, oh, snap. Like, I guess I'm actually doing this now. And I think that's something that's really important when you have an idea. Is you have to take baby steps at a time, right? For me, it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to record a podcast. If I were to really break it down, it really started with, hey, how about you first just start by messaging someone you'd like to interview and asking them if it's something they'd like to do. If they say yes, well then, yeah, I guess you got to go write up an interview. But what if they say no? Well, then you don't have to worry about it. So really breaking things up into just simple next steps. And then next thing you know, like one step leads to a next step, which leads to a next step. And then you end up having a podcast. So I'll pause there though. So I sent a message to them and a few of them said that they were interested. So from there I was like, shoot, okay, I guess this is happening. I then was like, all right, I don't actually know how to produce a podcast. Let me ask a friend. So I phoned a friend, and a good friend of mine, shout out to Tyler Nuss from a podcast that's called The Modern Acre. He was a groomsman in my wedding, one of my close friends. He actually has a podcast with over 200 episodes with him and his brother. They co-host it. So I just messaged him and I was like, hey, dude, I'm thinking about starting a podcast. Like, can you give me a cheat code? Like, how do you produce yours? Because I listened to his. It was great, high quality. They had on some amazing guests. They had like over 200 episodes. So I was like, you know what? I don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? And he was so kind to give me suggestions. He was the one who recommended certain platforms that I ended up using. So let's talk about that actually. Hey there. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying it and want to learn more from my content, I highly recommend subscribing to my weekly newsletter called The Guideline. It is an email newsletter for the modern barber, a quick read every Monday morning about the barber industry, where we are, where we have been, and where we are going. Sign up through the link in the show notes or on my website, barbadoza.com. All right, let's get back to the show. If you're starting a podcast, you need to figure out, how are you going to record it, especially if you're going to have guests. And so per Tyler's recommendation, I use a platform called Zencastr. So Zencastr is like similar to Zoom. It's like a video recording platform where I could see my guests, like our video cameras would be on, and then, they would record. I'd record my audio and the guest's audio, but they would record as two separate tracks, which was very nice, so that when I actually needed to edit them in GarageBand, I could just pull them in and, edit each audio track as its own. So I use Zencastr per the recommendation of Tyler. And then I also use a platform called Libsyn. That's my podcast hosting platform. So what that is I take my finished track or my finished episode, and once that's like exported as an MP3, I would upload that into Libsyn, and then Libsyn will deliver it to Apple Podcasts and to Spotify. So all I really have to do is just upload it into Libsyn, and then it does all the work. So you do have to figure out, what's going to be a part of what I call like my tech stack. So, Zencastr, that's where I record. GarageBand, that is where I edit. Libsyn is where I host. And then obviously I need to set up my accounts with Apple Podcasts and Spotify so that the show is actually showing up on those platforms. Okay, that was a lot there, but all things that you do need to think about if you are starting a podcast. Another big thing that I needed to do was I need to figure out my design. And so, what will be my podcast art? What will be my show art? When, people are maybe searching for a barber podcast, it's always important for me to invest into my design. And so, huge shout out to Mike Miller. I've talked about him before. He does all my graphic design. And so I was really excited to talk to him about this project that I wanted to do. And I, got on a call with him and we talked about kind of the vision for Beyond Barber School and what I was hoping for. And, he had a couple iterations on the show art that you all see. And I'm very, very stoked on how it turned out. He also created a episode art for me. So like all of the episodes has a certain template, and he made that for me and then sent it to me. And then I do all my episode art editing on Adobe Photoshop. So, which I had never used before. So that's also another part of my tech stack is I do all my editing, graphic design editing through Adobe. Okay, what else? Let's talk microphone, other part of my tech stack. So when I record on a very simple, just USB microphone. So this is an Audio-Technica mic that just plugs straight into my computer. The guests that I had on, I don't think any of them had any fancy microphone of any sorts. A lot of them were just recording straight off the laptop. Some had like maybe headphones in, but none of them were having anything crazy, which I was very pleased with because they all sound really great. In some times, honestly, I think their audio might sound just as good, as if not a little bit better than mine. For me, when I would have to edit myself in post-production, it could be a little bit harder because I was recording on a mic. I don't know if that makes sense, but so that's all kind of like tech stack things that you would need, like in terms of setting up of your accounts and all that jazz. Let's talk about a pretty funny story though, how you actually launch. So this was, I just shared very quickly, in 10 minutes or whatever, how I created the podcast. But let me tell you, this was hours and hours of, actually making it happen. And so I self-produced this entire podcast, obviously with the exception of like my graphic design art. Like I'm doing everything. And so I am, I'm setting up the interviews, I am writing the interview outlines, and then I'm coordinating a time. I'm actually, recording it, making sure that it's all working properly, which during Corey London's episode, after the recording for his track actually didn't save, which was kind of a nightmare. I thought that the whole episode was going to be gone, but thank you, Corey. You're the real MVP. We were able to recover it. Thank you to also Zencaster's like troubleshooting instructions that they had. But that was a moment, the only time it happened, when I was afraid that the whole entire episode was lost. But good thing that it wasn't, because that was such a great episode. Another funny thing that happened was on the day that I launched. And so when I was talking to Tyler about Libsyn, there was kind of a miscommunication there. I just assumed that all I had to do was upload my MP3, finished track into Libsyn, and then Libsyn would just, kick it out to, or publish it to Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So the day I launched it, I posted it and published it off Libsyn, and then I go to Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and it's nowhere to be found. And I'm like, okay, there must be a delay. I keep checking it, like 2 hours go by, and it's not showing up. So then I'm Googling, like, how do you set up a podcast on Apple Podcasts? Like, it's not coming through Libsyn. And sure enough, and this is so silly, but you have to create like an account through Apple Podcasts, and you need to create an account through Spotify, and then you have to sync those to Libsyn, right? Libsyn isn't just gonna post it if you don't have an account on Apple, which just insert face palm. So when I had that, I had to scramble, and like I had to create an Apple Podcast account for my show. I had to have a Spotify, create a Spotify account for my show, and then I had to sync it, which luckily it didn't take long. Like I did get it done that same day, so I was able to launch it just about like 6 hours later than I wanted to, but we ended up pulling it off. But man, that was hilarious. I was like, oh, all this build up to launch my podcast, and it wasn't working. So funny. So it hasn't been like an easy road, and I know throughout the year there were waves of me recording more episodes, and then I kind of went silent for a while. Part of it is because it is a lot of work. I'm not going to lie. To self-produce a podcast can be a decent amount of work. But anyways, it's totally worth it. I mean, there's been people who have just messaged me out of the blue. Like I had a message the other day, someone that I don't know, and they just DM'd me on Instagram and just said, hey, really like your podcast. I found it randomly online, and just keep it up. Excited for another episode. And so if you're one of those people out there who've been enjoying my podcast, I know it's not just barbers who actually have listened. I know some of my friends who are not barbers, they've listened. I really appreciate the support. It has meant a lot. And it does, though it is a lot of work to produce this, it's totally worth it. And I'm very, very grateful to have some amazing interviews recorded, and able to pull some quotes there that have been really impactful to me in my career. So thank you, huge thank you to all of the guests that I had on this year, and also huge thank you to anyone who has tuned in. I'll do a shameless plug. If you have been listening, please, give me a review on Apple Podcasts. That would mean a lot to me. or shoot me a message on Instagram and, maybe tell me something you like or how you found out about the show. Or I'm also always open to hearing about maybe ideas or types of guests that you'd love to have me bring on. What can you expect from Beyond Barber School in 2023? I will continue to have guests. That's something that I do want to do. I actually have a few that are in the works right now that I am very excited about. Obviously, it will take a little bit of time for me to I haven't recorded the episodes, and then it will take time to obviously produce them, but very excited to have some guests that will be on. I also will have more solo episodes is also part of the plan. Part of that is because they are less work for me to do, but another part of it is a good friend of mine. His name is Matt Melendrez. He has a podcast that's called The Roll Down. Highly recommend checking that one out. And I was talking to him the other day, and he was mentioning how, they're planning some more episodes for his podcast, and one of his mentors challenged him and said, their podcast has a lot of guests on their show, kind of similar to mine. And when they were planning more episodes, they kept talking about having a certain amount of guests that are on. And his mentor just mentioned, hey, why do you feel like you need to have guests on all the time? Like, is there maybe something there that you're afraid that maybe your perspective isn't enough? Like, she was just kind of challenging them and saying, we don't want you to necessarily hide behind the guests that are on your show. Like, you actually have something very valuable to say. Like, what if your perspective is actually enough, and maybe your perspective is one that your audience actually wants to listen to and hear more of? And so I actually really resonated with that. I do feel like at times I might want to hide behind some of the guests that I bring on, and do struggle believing that I have something valuable to say. And so, kind of as a challenge for even myself in 2023, I do want to do more solo episodes to share my perspective. It will be similar to what I did with the mini series called The Guideline. And I actually did get pretty positive feedback from The Guideline, especially on the how I started my business episode. I had people messaging me saying thank you, and also during the how to manage my money and like budgeting, I had, about 20 people messaging me asking for my barber bookkeeping template. And so, yeah, the guideline, the content that I did there, I think I'm going to continue doing more of that. You can expect more of that in some of these episodes in 2023. Okay, speaking of the guideline, this is kind of a big update for me, kind of big announcement. The mini series that I had called The Guideline in this podcast is actually now inspired a weekly newsletter, email newsletter, that I will be launching January 2nd, 2023. So on Monday, I'm launching it. So every Monday, I will be sending out an email newsletter for all of 2023. That's right. So that's going to be 52 different issues of the guideline in email format. So why the guideline? Well, if you're a barber listening to this, we all know the importance of the guideline. If you're not a barber, I'll explain it to you. So whenever a barber gives a haircut, you often start by setting a guide. And so it's essentially just a cut that you do in the haircut that will be a guide for the rest of the haircut. And so the importance of the guideline for a barber is if you don't have one, you don't know where you are in the haircut. You don't know where you've been in the haircut, and you don't necessarily know where we're going in the haircut. And so I'm going to be kind of taking that inspiration and doing that in an email newsletter. I'm going to be talking about where we are in the barber industry, where we have been, and where I think we are going as an industry. So I'm really excited about this, honestly. It's probably one of the, I get excited about a lot of things, but I am very excited about doing the guideline. It's going to be a challenge for me to commit to doing it every single week, but I'm up for the challenge. And there are a lot of topics. Like, I've brainstormed more than 52 topics that I'll cover. And so the first episode will be, or not episode, but the first newsletter will be dropping Monday, January 2nd. And you can subscribe through the link that's in my bio, or you can go straight to my website, barberdoza.com, to subscribe. It's completely free to subscribe. You can unsubscribe whenever you want, but I'm pretty pumped on that. So if you do enjoy my content, enjoy my podcast, I actually think that would be a really, probably make sense for you to maybe check that out. I think you'll probably like it. We'll wrap up there. This thing's coming up almost on 30 minutes. And so I just want to say thank you again. If you're listening to this, thank you for tuning in to, this show. I mean, there's obviously a ton of podcasts that are out there, and for you to sit down and listen to me wherever you are, you're driving or in your home doing your dishes or whatever, you're posted up in between haircuts, I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope that something has been valuable for you as you've listened and you've learned something or resonated with something, whatever it is. Just want to say thanks, and a huge thank you to all the guests that have been out on the show in 2022. There's so a lot of hard work that goes into creating a podcast, and so this episode, I hope, gave you, you learned something about how podcasts are created. If you are interested in creating your own, maybe that gives you a little bit of a head start so that you don't have to try to reinvent the wheel. If you want more like detailed information or detailed advice on how to start a podcast, please feel free to message me. I'd be happy to connect with you and at least just share more about what I did and maybe some things that I would have done differently. But yeah, let me know if that's something you're interested in. Okay. Happy New Year. I will see you all in 2023. And one final plug, if you're interested, use the link in my bio to go subscribe to my new weekly newsletter that is called The Guideline. Thanks so much. I'll see you later.